We are being streamed live on the internet, so when you do come up to testify, make sure you are speaking into the microphone so folks out in the world can hear us. The same thing goes for the committee members. Make sure you're speaking into the microphone. It's on and the green light's on. It looks like these microphones should be familiar to all of us here. So that being said, for those of you who are new to this process, make sure you come up and address the chair. I know it seems like kind of a formality, but it helps keep things professional and focused on ideas and not personality. So make sure you address either representative or myself, and obviously same thing goes for the community members. That being said, we have a few folks in attendance. I think Senator Kinsky's here somewhere. There he is.
Welcome to Sheridan. It's a pleasure to have you all here. Just a reminder, we're going to have a get-together this evening at Luminous, reception that was sponsored by the Region Pest Districts. And they're covering the food, and you're on your own for the beer, except that I did volunteer to cover the first round for all the legislators in attendance. And all the folks here are welcome as well. We did this with Judiciary last year, and it was supposed to be just kind of an appetizer, and I think the last dog died about 9:30 or 10. It's a nice venue to just visit and relax and get to know folks. So welcome to Sheridan. It's our pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, sir. We also have a representative from the calling.
Good morning. My name is Jana Clements, and I'm the Executive Office Manager for President Paul Young and the Board of Trustees. On behalf of them, I'd like to welcome you to Sheridan College. We're very proud of our campus, and we hope you'll have time to just take a walking tour and view our beautiful campus. We thank you for all of your support.
Well, thanks for having us, and boy, it's a beautiful time of year here in Sheridan, so we're lucky to be here.
Yes, welcome.
Any other elected officials? I know I saw some. Co-chairman between the House and the Senate. And the second question is what is going to require to officially sponsor a bill going into session. The default is that it's just a simple majority of function as a majority of both houses, so a majority of senators and a majority of representatives. Obviously, you think about the benefits and drawbacks for each one. Going into the budget session, the benefit of changing that rule, we don't introduce a bill that is bound to die in one of the committees later on in the session. But obviously, the drawback is if one of the senators is gone, then you might be able to fill a bill with just two people voting against it. So think about that. Mr. Anderson, do you want to go over that?
Sure, Mr. Chairman. So I think we've covered it pretty well. Under Joint Rule 17. At your first meeting following a general session, you need to, or if you don't adopt any alternative rules to the standard rules, then you're deemed to have adopted the standard rules. What I passed out to you is something Joint Revenue has done the last couple of years, which is the standard rules are written as a chairman and vice chairman. As a chairman owner noted, most of the committees have operated as co-chairman rather than chairman and vice chairman. So this is simply just what the rules would look like if you adopt co-chairman instead of chairman. And then any other alternatives you want to adopt to the standard rules, this is the meeting to do it. Otherwise, you have the standard rules.
All right, thank you. So I'll entertain a motion on our rules for the interim. Okay. Senator Doss, what's your motion?
Excuse me?
What's the motion today?
I'll move a motion to accept the current
Okay, the proposal files.
Proposal.
Okay. And a second.
Some discussion.
Yeah.
Does that also include the fact that, open house center have to approve any bills? I don't see that even on this job.
So, Mr. Chairman, I think it would be, if you wanted to adopt that, that would be, I think, a second motion. I think you do one motion of whether to do co-chairman, and then you do a second motion regarding if you wanted to require passage by both houses. Otherwise, the default is just passage by the majority of a quorum.
Still looking for a second.
Second.
Okay, all right, so that's a proposal, have co-chairman, but a simple majority required to sponsor legislation. So, any discussion or amendments on the motion?
Question?
Okay, question being called, all those in favor of the interim rules that are adopted by the Revenue Committee, May 11th, 2017, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. Motion carries. Okay, so moving right along, please take note, ladies and gentlemen, we're ahead of the agenda right now. So first order of business is wildlife and wildlife management damage. So we have the Game and Fishery Department of Ag, whoever wants to go first. Okay, sorry, ceremonies, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What we just voted on was to adopt the co-chairman as one of the rules. Did we discuss the fact that it was majority both houses have to vote in favor of the bill?
We did not, Senator, that's where we asked for amendments and nobody offered an amendment, so we can.
You're way ahead of us.
Okay, sorry.
I'd like to make that motion.
Okay, so we have a motion by Senator Moniz to amend the rules to require a majority of both houses to sponsor legislation. Now, if I understand this correctly, it's not to make amendments to legislation, just to ultimately sponsor as a committee, and that's it, everything else.
Right.
Okay, seconded by Senator Steinmetz. Any discussion on this? Who's back there? Representative Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I'm against that motion. I think it should be a majority of everybody here. And if, I guess we get into legislation and one body or the other decides they don't like the bill, they can decide at that point. I like the way it is, a simple majority. I'll be no.
Somebody else?
I'd like, I made the motion, but if we can't pass it out of the committee, it's not going to have no success during the sessions. That's my rationale behind it.
Senator Steinmetz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's my rationale as well, and I just don't want to see us wasting time in a budget session. We're coming into the budget session where time is limited and we need to focus on that. So if we can't get it out of this committee, then I don't see the point. Thank you.
Senator Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm against the motion for the majority, and here's why. It was already mentioned that if one or more of the senators were unable to attend, we might have a problem with the quorum, first of all. But also, I think the legislation is sponsored out of the committee to stand in the legislature on its own merits. And it's pretty much based on Mason's rules, as you know, and the standard rules that we all voted for with no negative votes had the requirement in there that the default to the majority decision would prevail. So I think we should stick with that.
Any further discussion? Okay, I'd just like to point out that regardless of the result of this vote, we on this committee we work together between chambers and like other committees in the legislature, and I'm sure it'll work out either way depending on no matter what happens. So, all those in favor of the motion to require a majority of both chambers to sponsor legislation, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say no.
No.
Chair sends out. All those in favor, please raise your hand. Six ayes. Those opposed? Guess it's about 8. So that motion fails. At least it wasn't 5 to 7 or 5 to 9. So. All right, moving on. Now we are ready for Department of Agriculture and Conservation.
Chairman, Deputy Moto, Director of the Department of Agriculture, and I have Scott Nippert with the Wyoming Game and Fish Department with us.
Sure.
I saw the green light, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry, I thought it was on. Doug Miyamoto, Director of the Wyoming Department of Agriculture, with Scott Nippert from the Wyoming Game and Fish Department here today. We can discuss our predator management program really in about any direction that you would prefer to take it. I have some budget figures I have been told to prepare for discussion about history of funding. We do happen to be on the 20th anniversary of the creation of the Animal Damage Management Board, so I think it's a good time for this discussion, but this has been one of our most successful programs in the department for quite some time. It's been funded to a real degree since the 2007-2008 biennium, and that funding has ranged everywhere from, just a little bit above $5 million per biennium to a high of about $6.75 million a biennium ago, and now we're down to about $5.2 million today. So we're about $750,000 down from where the program started initially in 2007. It's been through a lot of changes, and the real struggle with the budgeting aspect of the Animal Damage Management Board is that it's been hard for our district boards to plan. A lot of the funding that is generously provided through this body to fund local predator boards, they go out and hire part-time and full-time trappers through contracts with APHIS Wildlife Services to provide the control that they need. But it's hard to make those contracts, especially for the human resources side of professional trappers, when you're not sure what the funding level is going to be, or if it's going to be fluctuating up and down in any given years. And so that would be one of our main struggles now. A lot of the boards are adapting to pretty significant budget cuts for the 2017-2018 biennium that I don't think is foreign to anybody here. But I would be happy to discuss any
maybe tell us a little about the, there's local and state funding sources for the board. Is that correct? You can go into that, how much proportionally, roughly, each one is. And so I think we're all over. We talk about 30% cut from state funds, but there's some local funds there too, right?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, to answer that question and get into specifics about how the program works is that of the total allocation, most of that goes out to the counties and direct support for work that they do in the predator program. But there's also $244,000 that is set aside for research projects, and that money is leveraged with $200,000 per biennium that is dedicated from the Game and Fish Department, where research projects are undertaken mostly about the impact of predatory animals on wildlife populations. So we've done a lot of mule deer studies, a lot of antelope studies, a lot of raven impacts on sage grouse type of studies. A lot of research has gone into what is the correct level of predator control and how do we get there most efficiently. And that's been a successful program as well. That's one pot of funding. And then there's another $120,000 approximately per biennium that's set aside for rabies management. And so those districts that have rabies issues annually, typically it seems to be that Johnson County, Sheridan County, and Campbell County are the three that consistently apply for those funds. We haven't had a huge problem in the rabies realm in recent years. We have a simmering pot. It seems like, there's always some skunks or some raccoons that test positive once in a while, but it's not been a terrible problem. And then out of the main allocation of funding that we have, so for this last year, we just got done with a meeting about a month ago and allocated about $2.25 million. Within any given biennium, we also have $250,000 that has recently been set aside for wolf management. Now, upon the delisting and the removal of protections of the Endangered Species Act for the gray wolf, That's what launched this program. We've been through iterations with wolf management, as many of you are aware. Protections are provided by the courts, are taken back off. We've had everything from indemnity programs in the predator zone to help offset some of the loss that our producers have had, to now what we have is a pure management program for wolves. And again, that's $250,000 per biennium right now. We're doing fairly well with that program. It doesn't look like we're going to run out of money during this biennium for that program. As you know, wolf populations and the amount of damage that they do tend to cycle. And so it's hard for us to predict what'll happen, but I think we have the resources now that we can handle that. The way that the wolf program works is that if we're experiencing depredating wolves on livestock or wildlife in the predator zone, that producer can call our animal damage management board coordinator. We just got a new one. His name's Jerry Johnson. And they can ask for assistance. They need to get it certified that it was probably wolves that did the damage. So they'll have somebody that is qualified to go out and take a look at the depredating activity and deem that to be wolves. In that case, that predator district and wildlife services can go out and do that control work and submit a request and invoice back to the Department of Agriculture, and we'll reimburse them for those efforts. So that's how that program works. And those are kind of the levels of funding that we're operating under today in the different pots of money.
Any questions for Mark?
What's the status of the grizzly bear situation? Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Moniz, I would like to defer to my friend from the Game and Fish Department on the status of grizzly bears.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Moniz, due to a federal court ruling, the grizzly bear, long story short, is a relisted species, and as such is under the authority and mandate of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
I understand we put it in the hands of our representatives at the federal level. Is there been any news on that front as far as trying to get something done in that area?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Moniz, that's being worked through our AG's office and the governor's office regarding the best course of action to look at the lawsuit and see what legal course of action the state would like to take to try to get the grizzly bear back in the state's management hands.
So that's all you know at this point?
That's Mr. Chairman, Senator, that's kind of where we're at. The department is still very engaged in day-to-day management and conflict resolution of grizzly bears, but the actual management and oversight is still through the Fish and Wildlife Service, and we're just working through the legal hoops to determine how we're gonna move forward countering the lawsuit.
Okay, one more if I could, Mr. Chairman. Another question would be based on the tribes up in the northern part of the state with that yelling of elk up there. Where are we on that issue?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Moniz, you're referring to Herrera versus the state of Wyoming, which was decided last month by the Supreme Court. That based on that ruling, the state, again, is looking at its legal options. Long story short, the state is going to remain status quo on how we enforce our game laws until such time that case is referred back to the courts here in Sheridan County to review 3 issues, and then so we could be, a year or more out before that actual issue is completely settled. The state is remaining status quo. We will enforce the game and fish laws as they are on the books at this time for anybody, regardless of who they are.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Concerning Herrera versus state of Wyoming, what portions of Wyoming does that cover? Is it where the Crow Reservation was originally, or if you know that answer, I would like. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Senator, Representative Blake. So most of that, I don't have the map with me. I know we're going to give a very in-depth presentation at Tier at the end of the month, but it's basically along the Montana, Wyoming border, the Bighorns, down the southern Bighorns over west, not quite to Jackson, and then further south. So it's a it is a pretty good chunk of real estate. You know, the other issue is the impacts this could have on other treaties with Native Americans. So this is a pretty big issue, but I'm sorry I didn't bring all that stuff, but we are going to have a very in-depth presentation at TRW on that topic, but it is a pretty good size real estate.
Thank you.
And just to follow up on that, really on things you're not prepared to answer right now, but does that apply only to federal land or is it state and private? What does it apply?
Mr. Chairman, that would basically be federal land, private land would not be covered under the treaty. One of the big issues is the Bighorn National Forest considered occupied lands? And that's one of the main questions of the argument or of the issue is whether the Bighorns are considered occupied or not. So that is an issue that will have to be decided in pending court rulings or court hearings.
So if you're a hunter or an angler who feels that we have to have federal land in the state to go on, that may not be an accurate understanding. Is that correct?
It'll definitely impact, Mr. Chairman, it could definitely have impacts to hunting and fishing and wildlife management in the state.
Okay. All right, so we'll get back on track here, but I just want to make sure that I understood that correctly. A question for you to make this be better for game and fish. Director Milo mentioned some studies that were funded mostly for game and fish as far as the effect of predators on wildlife. Could you maybe share some of the summaries of your findings of those studies?
Sure, Mr. Chairman. So I'm going to give a little precursor, if I may, first. So in addition to the funding that Director Miyamoto brought up, there's also two other funding sources. One is through landowner coupons. When a deer, elk, or antelope is killed on private land, the landowner has the option of being paid $16 for that animal. An option that landowner has is to, instead of getting reimbursement for that payment directly to them, they have the ability to designate that money to go to ADNB. That has a very low amount of money, down to from $0 being donated in 2012 to a high of 8,800 in 2000. That's the first year that program was available. That's really fluctuated. The second one is the sale of a wildlife management damage stamp, which is administered by the Game and Fish. Those stamps are sold for $12.50, of which 50 cents goes to the licensed selling agent that sells that stamp as revenue to them for doing that service. Again, those stamps have been very, very limited in sales, with a high of 365 in 2005 to a low of about 73 in 2017. And currently, the cost to administer that stamp versus the sales of that stamp is in the red. So it costs more of Game and Fish to administer that program than the revenue that's being generated for predator control. So those have not been a significant, neither one of those have been a significant funding source for animal predator control. So Game and Fish projects, when we talk about predators, it's what's defined by statute as predatory animals, but it also includes trophy game, grizzly bears, mountain lions, black bears, and gray wolves in the trophy game area. So annually, like coming Thursday, I believe, is the meeting where the commission's $100,000 will be donated or designated to project submissions. Currently, we have 19 projects on the table for the $100,000, plus there's an additional, I don't know the exact amount of additional monies that will be available for these projects. And those projects range from everything from help funding a contract with Wildlife Services to address big game damage by trophy game species. We've had that program in effect with Game and Fish for many, many years. It's a very successful program. It puts Wildlife Services folks on the ground, assisting Game and Fish, dealing with damage caused by trophy game animals, because it's a very significant issue in certain parts of the state and allows us a much more timely response. Other projects include actual removal of true predators under the state definition, i.e. coyotes in certain areas, mainly for mule deer. Also involves many or several research projects trying to understand the impacts of predators and trophy game animals to certain species in certain situations. So it's a wide array and variety. Those projects are ranked annually through the Game and Fish for what we feel is a priority to spend that money or how to designate that money to those projects. Sometimes they're funded in full, sometimes they're funded partially, and sometimes they're not funded at all. We also work with our local predator management boards throughout the year to come up with these projects and try to leverage our money and their money to do the best for wildlife, but also to livestock interests as well.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I guess I have a question going back to wildlife damage management stamp revenue and then also the landowner coupon donations. Is that programs that are advertised a lot, or do people even know that they're there, I guess? And has there been an option of maybe lowering the stamp to make it try to pick up lots more people?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, so on the landowner coupons, when the landowner submits the landowner coupon affidavit for payment, there's a check box on there, which they check, they want the payments themselves or to the ADMB. And so that's a decision that every landowner makes themselves, so that's there. On the stamp, our license agents are supposed to request every person that buys a license, whether they want to add to search or provide a donation to search and rescue, as well as buy the ADMB stamp. Whether that's happening or not, like at Walmart's or any other license agent, I don't have a good feel for that. I know at our regional offices, that's one of the options that people are asking when they buy a license, and many times by the time they buy their license, conservation stamp license, et cetera, they just don't donate to the management stamp, predator management stamp.
Follow up. Go ahead. Mr. Chairman, thank you. How much is the search and rescue stamp? Is it quite a bit lower?
Search and rescue is a donation that you can just make any amount that you want. It's not an actual stamp, as is our access. We also ask for access yes donations. So those are all amounts that any person can submit based on what they feel would be appropriate for them. It can be $0 or $1 or $2. We try to do it in full dollar increments, but it's not a set amount.
Any further
And
questions?
so the second part of the question, as I recall, the AD&D sets the price of that stamp annually, and it's been $12 since its inception. Or for the last, since 2000, it's been $12.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. So has the board or the Petween or the districts talked about this bunch and thought about maybe lowering it and maybe getting more people to do it?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, yes, the Animal Damage Management Board has discussed the predator management stamps a lot since I've been co-chairman of the board. It used to be that there was actually an artwork contest that went along with the program, just like for conservation stamps and other things. We don't pay for the reproduction of that, and there actually isn't a physical stamp anymore. It's an online stamp. We recognize that it's a way for people to get money into the predator management program without receiving the physical stamp. And so we have played with different options of determining if there was a way that we could drive up the demand for that stamp. I am unaware if the price has been changed in the recent past. It hasn't in my time since being on board.
Senator Shantz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This seems to be an example of a program that's not working very well. And so what do you see as the options going forward that we can either get it to where it needs to be, or what would happen if we eliminated it? What are our options?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Steinmetz, we have discussed not doing the program, but it's one of those topics that we see it as a potential. We're still trying to figure out if there's a way to make it more profitable, and I think not producing the art is one way to do that. But then trying to get buy-in into the program has admittedly been difficult. The program hasn't worked very well. We have discussed not doing it at all, but we hate to take the tool off because it doesn't cost a significant amount of money to administer the program the way that it is. And we do think that it has potential to bring awareness to the existence of the predator board and the individual districts. We wish that it got more support than it does today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And that's pretty much similar to what Senator Stamets suggests, but is the overall department necessarily worse off financially with it than without it? Like going back before 2000 when it was established, is this, I mean, it tends to lose money more than it doesn't. So has it been more costly than not, if you compare it to what was going on prior to its creation?
Mr. Chairman, I would respond to that by saying that it doesn't have a significant enough impact to move on it one way or the other to say that this is costing us so much money that we need to remove the availability of the stamp. And it's also not one of those that is significant enough to where it's impacting our ability to allocate funds for predator management. It's one of those issues that we talk about with ADMD. Most years when we meet, we say, well, what do we want to do with the stamp? And usually it's decided, well, it's not hurting us. You know, it's something that's out there for advertising, and if somebody did want to support it, this would be a mechanism for them to do that. But it hasn't been a significant contributor over the years.
Yeah, I guess I'll just make sure I understand the testimony here. So in terms of the annual monetary contribution from the Game and Fish Department to predator management is around $200,000, and is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, on a biennial basis, it's 200,000. On an annual basis, it's 100,000, and we leverage that with a biennial amount allocated from the legislative process of 244. So it's half and half almost. There's a little bit more general fund allocation to the research projects than there is from Game and Fish, but it's fairly equal. $100,000 from Game and Fish, $120,000 about per year. That is ADMD funds.
Okay, and that's specifically for wildlife programs. That's not the overall program, right?
Mr. Chairman, that's correct.
And just for context, the overall program, what's the annual budget on that compared to the roughly 100,000? Wildlife specifically.
Mr. Chairman, what's the number you're after again? I'm sorry.
Just overall expenditures for animal damage management board statewide. Roughly.
Okay, in 2019, funding available that just went to the boards, 2.15 million.
Okay, all right. Okay, good to have that context. And so you mentioned the studies that occurred based off of that, try to assess the impact predators have on wildlife as a result of the hunting public. What were you have a general synopsis of the results of those studies? What exactly is the effect? I mean, do predators in fact negatively affect wildlife populations?
Mr. Chairman, I have a few thoughts on some of those studies and can point to some that really stand out in my mind in my time with the Animal Damage Management Board. And then if it's all right with you, I would turn it over to Scott to get into some of what they noticed with wildlife populations. But just last year in 2018, we had studies on everything from predation and on survival of newborn mule deer in the Wyoming range. Coyote removal to enhance Stove Gulch mule deer fawn survival. We've had some raven studies, the Truman County raven removal. Mule deer fawning grounds in the Southwest Bighorns. And the ones that really stick in my mind were the studies that were done on ravens in particular in Southwest Wyoming. We had some partnerships with Utah State University that showed some pretty surprising numbers on the effectiveness, the efficiency of ravens as predators. And that one really hit home for me. There was something like between 80 and 90% of nesting sites were depredated on by ravens in that study area. That was one of them that really came home for me. Another one of the kind of trends that I've noticed in the research that's been done under this program is that the driver for mule deer seems to be snow and weather as much as anything. But you know, when conditions get tough and the snowpack is higher, then obviously predation is something that can be very significant on the survival as well. And it takes a bad situation and makes it to where it's untenable, and you can have survival and loss rates that are unacceptable, anywhere from 90 to 100% in Southwest Wyoming for 2018, I believe. Very difficult conditions, and we have some domestic sheep operations in that same area of the state that really just can't stand that much predation on top of difficult conditions already. And so those are kind of the things that have been brought to my attention through this research, and we have some pretty good reports that have come out of that. But I would say if there's one of them, it was impacts of radiance on sage grouse that really stuck with me.
Mr. Chairman, committee, so many of these projects are 3, 4, 5 years in length, and many of the big ones we have going on right now are year 2 or 3, so the exact results are unknown, but we are starting to see some results or some information, preliminary information that if you do targeted removal of predators at certain times of year, certain locations after certain circumstances, i.e. the winters that we had last couple of years ago, where in the Pinedale country, you know, about 100% of the fawns died, and a significant number of our collared bills in our research project died as well. Following that winter, we actually spent department money to target coyote removal and transition range from winter ranges to summer range fawning ranges to target coyotes to try to minimize predation on newborn fawns, neonates during that critical time of the year to try to get them up to the summer range. So we feel that's been a project that's had some benefit. Again, many of these other projects are in their initial or middle phases, are still being done, but there is some signs that, if very targeted, specific outcomes, that there could be some positive impacts to wildlife populations, primarily mule deer.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Larson.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. So the Game and Fish does spend some money in controlling of some predators, and do they do it internally, or is that contracted out?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, so I'll answer that in 2 different ways. So on our trophy game damage, obviously we have a trophy game section with our 6 or 8 employees who deal strictly with conflict, especially damage to livestock. So that's all internal operations done by folks. That's also where we use our partnership with Wildlife Services to assist us with that work. Annually, we get from $15,000 to $25,000 of the ABMD money to help fund that. But we spend, you know, depending on the year, more than that with that program. Other than that, again, these 2 instances I talked about where the department funded it from their internal funds, so the need based on the winter and the impacts of the year is the department funded leaf removal, targeted coyote control, which we again contracted separately with Wildlife Services to do that aerial work because they have the equipment, the expertise, and the bodies to do so due to the requirements of being able to take wildlife out of aircraft.
Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Going back to where when applicants are filling this out online and they can check the box or not, whether you're in state or out of state, are you filling out the same form effectively? I mean,
Mr. Co-Chairman, that is correct. The landowner coupon affidavit form is the same regardless if you're a resident or non-resident. And so, yes, everybody has the opportunity to check the box.
okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Do you have that spreadsheet that you gave us, Andy? I did have, yeah. Could you explain the fluctuation in the cost to administer the program? Looking at 2006 and 2007, what affects the fluctuation in administration of the program?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Moniz, I don't have the answer for that. I'm not a fiscal person, but I can sure find out for that. I hate to make any assumptions, but I can get that information for you and provide it.
And just a quick follow-up. Do you have, put you on the spot here, do you have any suggestions for how to make this program more successful?
Mr. Chairman, ceremonies, I really don't. I think Director Miyamoto said it, is that, just getting education out there and that I think the general public, just when it comes to predator control, they don't understand it or want to fund it. I don't have really a solution. I know we have it out there in our brochures and the ability of what it's for and so on and so forth, but it's like pulling teeth for people to buy a stamp and then for, landowners to want to submit their coupons for the program. And so I don't have a solution for it.
Senator Claus.
Mr. Chairman, is there anything that's keeping us from just making this mandatory with every hunting license to have this stamp?
Go ahead. Mr. Chairman, Representative Clausen, my understanding of the statute is that it's a mandatory program versus, it's correction, a voluntary program versus a mandatory program. So to make this mandatory, I believe it would take a statute change to require that.
Okay, any further questions for Department of Agriculture? Mr. Chairman, who's that? Representative Larson, okay.
Sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So how many licenses do we sell a year, total of everything?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Larson, I don't have that number off the top of my head, but it's significant. Last couple of years, we've increased, deer and antelope licenses statewide. I think elk licenses alone are 41,000. I couldn't tell you right now off the top of my head for what we have for deer and antelope. I can sure get that information and make sure everybody on the committee receives that.
That would be great. I guess it makes you wonder if we even made mandatory $1. Maybe that might be something to think about.
Okay, Representative Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Would you be able to speak to the impact over the years of, not fully, or not making 100% success on the predator management versus the impact on agriculture? And also, to what extent are we receiving any support from the federal partners?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Henderson, thank you for the question. That was one of the points that I would really like to hit on. The impact has been significant in the district's ability to respond to predators on both livestock and it's been unfortunate. That being said, we have the finest predator control program, and I think that we still do. It's a very good program. It has been for a very long time due to a lot of the hard work of the people that are in this room. That being said, particularly with our domestic sheep industry, this is just a vital program. I think if we don't have solid predator control out on the ground, that industry faces enough challenges the way that it is. And I think that it's worthwhile to have solid predator management programs throughout the state. I think it's the envy of most other states in the West. Our federal partners do play into the program, and they provide about $1.3 million of requests or of assistance that help leverage this funding that you as a legislature have graciously given to the department in order to administer this program, and that's appreciated. In addition to that, we've got about $1 million that comes in from our brand inspection fees, where ag producers are paying back into their own protection as well. The amount of refund requests that we get for predator control work has gone down in recent years. we're not getting as many refund requests as we have in the past. Those are all positive signs, and I think it's due to the effectiveness of the program, but we have some pretty good partners. I think that Wildlife Services has dealt with their own budgetary struggles in recent years, and they've seen their budgets decline significantly as well. But without being able to leverage their funding, we would be in even worse condition than we are with the program now. Wildlife Services plays an important part of our overall strategy in that they have the authority to do control work and trapping on federal grounds. And because our state is about half federally controlled, that's an important aspect as well. And so they're the ones that can do aerial operations over federal land, and it's something that's worth consideration as well. But I do appreciate the question very much. It allowed me an opportunity to show kind of the extent of the contributions.
Representatives. Thank you, Director. So having said that, what do you see from your perspective or from the perspective of the management board that we need to do to fix this?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Henderson, this is, I'm going to go out on my skis just a little bit here, but I can tell you that we had funding that was about $6.75 billion coming into the 17-18 biennium before we had to reduce budgets for a myriad of different reasons across state government. And I can tell you that the programs built at that level seem to be refined programs where we had the amount of control that was requested, the grant requests that were coming in for that funding was kind of matching the amount available. And we had fairly stable operations at that level. So I think that, that is something that it's hard to do. There's decisions obviously that have to be made, but the biggest challenge for most of our district boards, and I think they would tell you this, is it's hard to plan when we keep messing around with their budget balances. Because you're trying to hire trappers on these soft dollars, you don't know what your program may look like from year to year and how much you can dedicate to some issues that are happening to you locally. So stability in the program would be what I would tell you is the number one need for effective predator control. Some kind of predictability would be great.
Any further questions for our department heads before we move to public comment?
One question. So, Mr. Chairman, how do they determine the federal dollars you get? Is that based on, what's it based on?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Moniz, I would be guessing if I gave you an answer as to what goes into their annual contribution. It seems to have varied widely, but I'll see if I can get some additional information for you on that. I think I'll just leave it at that. I don't know the intricacies of Wildlife Services budgeting.
Okay, if there's no further questions, we appreciate your time, gentlemen. We'll see if we have any follow-up, so stick nearby there. But at this point, we'll take some public comment on this issue. So, anyone wants to testify, feel free to come on up. Okay, please introduce yourself for the record, even if you think we know who you are. I'm sure it's there for prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Representative Hunt, and the members of the committee. My name is Amy Hendrickson. I am here representing the Wyoming Association of County Predator Boards, and I'm also with the Wyoming Wool Growers Association. I just wanted to comment. First of all, I want to say thank you very much for doing this. As Director Miyamoto said, it's 20 years since this program really got started, and it is one of our key priorities with the Wyoming wool growers. There have been some really good discussion and some good points made here one of the things that I wanted to bring forward is that as the predator boards, as our association, our position is to ask for full funding back to the 6.75 million. It's about 6.65 million. Our members feel that that was a good amount. It allowed for adequate control. They were able to address both the livestock needs, the wildlife needs, and also the local communities with regard to skunks, primarily rabies and raccoons. One of the things that recently has come to our attention is that the amount of raccoon damage that gets that is done to irrigation systems, and it's the local trapper that has to go out and do that, and that can be very costly for the farmer or the rancher, but they don't really have a mechanism to pay in, which brings me to the predator management stamp and also the landowner coupon. I think one of the things that could help there is if that could go back to the county where the landowner is. I've had landowners say to me, well, I would check that box, but I want it to come to my county. And so I think that if there's some way that we could do that. I do also think that we need to have more promoted a little bit more there. And I think one thing that would help is if we could get more information out about what the actual impacts are to wildlife. We know what the impacts are to livestock. We talk about it all the time. You've heard it all. And it's devastating to our producers. We have one producer in the Midwest who in 2015 had a loss rate of 15%. And he said, that's pretty much a normal rate. And he said, we could live with that. There's not a business anywhere that can really survive at 15% loss. By 2018, his losses were 53%. And they were eagles, and Wildlife Services is the only is the only one that really can deal with that. He was the first rancher in 10 years to get an eagle permit, and he's down there by Midwest. And just to harass and to remove the eagles. They don't kill them, they remove them to other places. But then if you have sheep killing eagles and you move them to other places, you have to be very careful where you move them. Ravens are a major issue there. And again, Wildlife Services is the only agency that can actually address raven control. So that partnership with Wyoming, with the state and with the counties is crucial. And Wyoming has the best cooperative program with Wildlife Services in the country. And other states look to us to try to adopt some of the mechanisms that we have. But funding is very important there. So I think of those things, those are, so I think those are the main points that I wanted to make there, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Any questions? Yes, Mr. Chairman. Representative Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Back to the raven issue, I've heard that the ravens are pretty devastating on the sage grouse. Is that something that's been watched? I heard a county kind of studied that.
Mr. Chairman, yes, I understand that it's been pretty devastating. We do, and the part of the study that Director Miyamoto talked about as well. There, I don't have the details for you, but I'm happy to get them for you. We have in Johnson County, and I brought it with me, but I was a little bit late, so I didn't get it to LSO, but I can give it to the staff, they can hand it out to you. But in Johnson County, they have a map that shows the coyote takes overlap, and that's overlaid over where the sage-grouse leks are. So that kind of gives you an idea of what that kind of predation could be there as well.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Can you explain the county, how the county group is set up? I guess I can't think of the word. The predator board, geez. Yes. It's quite a few livestock, and then I think there's some that are actually nominated by the county commissioners and such.
Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the question. So the county predator boards consist of livestock producers, and all the livestock producers pay a predator fee that goes to that county. It's $1 for sheep. For sheep, I believe it's $1 a head. I think for everyone, it's $1 a head. And if you don't pay that, then you cannot participate in the ADMD program. So some counties do not participate. And so their brand inspection fees and predator fees are lower. Not the brand inspection, I mean their predator fees are lower. And so the predator boards also consist of sportsmen and outfitter groups. And they are the producer representatives are elected from the group of producers that pay the fees, and then there are other appointees from the county commissioners as well. I hope that answered your question.
Any further questions?
You mentioned, how many counties are not involved in paying that fee?
I believe that there are 19 involved. 19
19 of the 23
of the
are
23
involved.
are involved.
And you have a rough estimate as to the revenue generated from those $1 per head fees assessed on the producer?
The
revenue generated on an annual basis?
I don't know that particularly. It does vary, obviously, between, and so in other counties, for instance, Sweetwater, for instance, a lot of their livestock move out of their county and go to a different county for summer range. And so that county where they go to has to address the predator problems, but they don't get the money from, they don't get the predator fees because the inspection is done in a different county. So.
Director Miyamoto, do you have any insight on that?
Mr. Chairman, I looked up the numbers for last year. It looks like about $1 million statewide was collected in predator fees as part of the brand inspection process.
Okay, $1 million, you said. Any further questions for Ms. Henderson? All right, thank you, ma'am. Any further public testimony on this issue? Anybody going once, going twice? Okay, public comment is closed on this issue. Committee, we're discussing wildlife and livestock predator damage. Is there any motions? Co-Chairman Hunt.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I would make a motion that we have also draft up a bill that for out-of-state applicants, that what is currently a voluntary checkoff for the stamp box, that be mandatory. And I guess I'd like to see what the committee has to say about that. But several other people seem to put some variation of that forward. And I don't like mandatory anything, but I think that before we go into penalizing in-state hunters, that would be a start, is to make that donation, quote unquote, mandatory for out-of-state applicants. For that.
A second on that motion? Second by Representative Clausen. Any discussion? Representative Clausen.
I think we should make it just a non-refundable fee with the application of the license. It doesn't necessarily have to be on the draw. I'd like to make that an amendment.
Okay, so make the fee based on the application.
Call it an application fee, not necessarily a draw.
Okay, all right, there's a motion to amend the motion and Larson second, is that what I heard? No? Okay. Okay, so it'd be based off the application. Okay, second by Senator Cost, okay. Okay, Representative Henderson.
Is the intent of that amendment, thank you, Mr. Chairman, is the intent of that amendment to make it a percentage of the amount of the fees that are purchased, or the tags that are purchased?
It's my understanding, it's just a set fee for an application. And so depending on how many applications you get, you'll pay, I guess it'd be helpful if there's an amount of dollar fee. Is that correct, Representative Clausen?
Just for drafting's sake, Mr. Chairman, I think we should lower it to probably $4, but, yeah, just a flat fee for an application fee for us.
Okay, so it's $4 fee. And that's obviously, that could change. Okay.
And that's non-refundable to other than law.
Right, it'd be a one-time fee at the time of the application. And the session's okay with that. Okay. Any discussion on that amendment? Representative Larson?
Just on the whole motion, I guess, I was wondering if we could have the LSO maybe comment, I'm not sure on the constitutionality of that, if we just out of state and not in-state also.
Okay, Mr. Anderson, is there differences between out-of-state and in-state hunting licenses?
There's certainly different costs right now between the two licenses. I mean, it's something I'll certainly look into if the draft goes forward as to the appropriateness of that, but they are, as I'm aware, different prices for out-of-state and in-state currently.
Okay, and just to be clear, it seems like there's several different options we have, whether we make this mandatory fee for out-of-state and in-state or just out-of-state, or also allow flexibility as to what the actual fee would be. Obviously, once we get feedback from Game and Fish as to how many applications they get in a particular year, those all discussions we can have if the bill is drafted. But anyway, so the discussions on specifically the amendment, is there any further discussion on the amendment as proposed by Representative Clausen? Okay, question on the amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no.
No.
Motion carries. So we're back on the motion to draft the bill. Any further discussion on the bill as amended? Representative Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, hunters always get dinged for everything. I just, when do we force people from not hunting to making them pay for everything? So I'll probably no vote on this.
Representative Larson.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'm going to vote for it. I'm just reluctant. I kind of would think we include everyone.
Absolutely be an option moving forward if we draft the bill. Any further discussion on the motion to draft the bill as is? Okay. Question being called. All those in favor of drafting the bill as moved by Representative Hunt, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no.
No.
That motion carries. Okay, so any further discussion on this topic, any further motions on this topic when we're talking about predator damage from both livestock and wildlife? Representative Tassett.
Yes, I would like to move a motion on the.
Is there my answer?
Are we not on here?
Let's make sure you're talking about it.
Okay, I would like to move a motion on the funding to draft a bill to reinstate the funding back up to that 6.65 million that originally was a number of years ago. It was reduced down to the 4.3. I feel the cut in the funding is way disproportionate to a small program for loading up cuts more on the predator control than on statewide. The cut in the funding reduced the number of trappers that are available to work this problem. Predators cover a huge segment of the Wyoming's economy from not only hunting. I attended a CWD meeting here in Sheridan at the Game and Fish the other day last week, and they were talking about how the CWD was taking out the older populations of their game, and then the predators are turning around and wiping out the fawns. So the game are getting hit with a double whammy. And by reducing the number of trappers available to work on the predators, it has really impacted the wildlife just as much as it has the farming ranch. The sage grouse affects hunting, it affects oil and mineral development. I think that we need to go back to funding all of our expenses, whether on the ranch or down on Main Street has gone up. You go back to your 6.6 funding from a number of years ago, the cost of airplanes, helicopters is more than it was 3, 4, 5 years ago. So I would like to move a motion to draft legislation to move the funding back up to where it was 6.65 a number of years ago. I think that is only fair. I know the state is short on money and whatever, but it should not be done on the backs of the wildlife and the ag community.
Is there a second on that motion to basically move the funding back up to the original 6.6? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, second by Representative Winter. Any discussion? You already had something that Representative.
Yeah, I'm in favor of raising it up too, but I think with the budget session coming up, we need to look at what the governor's going to propose. Maybe we should write a letter to the governor saying that this committee endorses another $2 or $3 million from where it is right now. So I'm not sure if the bill would really, yeah, just my thoughts. I'm in favor of getting the money back where it was.
Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would agree with Representative White. I support the idea, I think. And at this time, the governor is just starting his down the road of putting the budget together. That we may have a better idea by our September meeting of where that's going. And so I think, I guess my preference would be to delay on that motion until the September meeting, and then we'll still have time between that and the November meeting to move forward with it. So that's my thought.
Any further discussion?
There's a comment as well. I would think Director Reed-Lomo and Human Fish, I guess I have a question for you. Are you considering asking for that additional funding going forward?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Moniz, I just got my budget instructions just a few days ago, and I haven't been able to review those fully now. And I don't have a list of exception requests that we will be moving forward during this session. It's hasn't been decided yet.
Just a comment, I see that the governor's budget process will be that it'll be a true biennial budget, and any supplemental budgets will be a true emergency. I think that was what he was thinking about. I was just curious if your thoughts whether you might ask for that additional funding.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Moniz, I can tell you that the department has always taken the biennial budgeting process very seriously. You didn't see a supplemental budget request from the department last year. We do try to reserve those for true emergencies. I have gotten word and did review enough of my budget instructions to say that what the governor's office termed as clawback funding requests will not be entertained. And so that is one of those things that I would have to look at really carefully about. Would it be considered in that vein? Would asking for restoration of funds in this account be in that same mindset? There's a lot of different things that happened to this fund. Some of it was proposed by the department and then approved by the governor's office and the legislature. Some of it was legislative, depending on the year. And so I haven't gone through the budgeting process fully yet to decide what our budget is going to look like.
Thank you. Well, Mr. Chairman, just a comment as well. I think the motion is premature at this point. I'm not sure that I would support the motions.
Further discussion? Go ahead, sir.
I would be willing to withdraw my motion at this time to get more input from the governor and the other powers that be and bring it back in September.
Is the second okay with that? Okay. Okay, well, the motion is withdrawn, especially for, I guess, some new members of the committee. You know, there's more than one way to skin a cat there. We can have a bill, basically, as we did, I think, last session, basically being a mini appropriations committee, saying we're just going to increase the funds to this particular account or that particular account. The other option is to work within the appropriations process and kind of respect committee number two's turf, to be frank, and maybe perhaps as Representative Blake suggested, just send a letter and work with the governor's office. And either way, I want to say I'm supportive of the idea, and I think it's very much worth our effort. Representative Blake, go ahead.
Would you like that in a motion?
What in the motion exactly?
To write a letter to the governor, see what his thoughts are for this committee, or chairman can contact the governor, whatever.
We can entertain, now we can entertain it at the September meeting once we have a better idea how the budget process is playing out. Any further discussion on this topic, committee? Okay, well, great. We're about 15 minutes ahead of schedule. We'll see how that holds. So we'll go ahead and take a 15-minute break. And hopefully we won't get too much trouble for coming back at 10 o'clock and starting the basic. back in order here. Okay, so we'll go ahead and call this meeting back to order. Now only 10 minutes ahead of schedule, but that's my fault. The rest of the day is devoted to invasive species. Obviously a very important topic. We're talking about preserving our natural habitat for our two or three top industries, that being agriculture and tourism, of course, heavily dependent on wildlife and the natural beauty of this state. And so we'll have several different venues or different subtopics within this topic, but we'll go ahead and start off with an overview. And hopefully, if we have an opportunity to break a little bit early for lunch, so we can actually go out and get food and get back by 1 o'clock. But we'll see how it goes, and we'll cap it off with a nice little tour of the research station, just about 20 minutes away, and we'll go over the details there, perhaps before we go to lunch and we'll hear from you on how that's going to work, so we can plan ahead. But we'll do that before we break for lunch. That being said, we'll go ahead and get into invasive species. Welcome.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'm Slade Franklin. I'm the Weed Pest Coordinator of the Wyoming Department of Agriculture. And I appreciate you guys inviting us here to talk about invasive species, especially in Sheridan. You are in the area where one of our higher priority issues are that you'll see this afternoon with two annual grasses, invasive grasses, both Medusa head and ventonata. High concerns for our state, high concerns for the western states as a whole. And we are trying our best to really get ahead of them by treating them here and be very proactive with the treatments we have. So University of Wyoming and the Sheridan County Weed and Pest has put together a little tour for you this afternoon. As mentioned, maybe at lunch, if you have different shoes, there's a little walking. I don't think we're going to make you walk up Cloud Peak, but there might be a little walking involved. So think of that when you're on your lunch break. But in terms of the Medusa head and ventonata, a lot of that discussion we'll let Brian Mueller from the University of Wyoming kind of give you an overview of those plants. I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of the weed and pest districts and how the weed and pest program works in the state. It's a shotgun approach, so at any time you guys want to stop me and focus on certain aspects of what I'm talking about, we can do that. Just to warn you, last time I was asked to do an overview of the weed and pest, it was for the Weed and Pest Council. It ended up being a 2.5-hour presentation, so I'm going to try to limit it a little more today for some very specific points. So one thing I'm not going to touch on with this presentation is components of the weed pest programs is prairie dogs, grasshoppers. We don't consider those invasive species. They're native species that weed pest districts do work with. But I did want to mention that we are expecting some issues this coming summer, or in the next maybe month or so, with grasshoppers in several places around the state. So we're not going to see the issues maybe we saw in 2010 and 11, but we certainly are a little concerned with some hot spots various places. So you might be hearing a little bit about that from your constituents this year. So with that, I did give you guys just a little bit of an overview of what the weed pest is, a little 4-page synopsis, talking a little bit about how the districts were formed, and again, just interrupt me if there's any place you guys want to focus on. But there is a pretty long, extensive history of weed control in the state of Wyoming. It really does date back to 1896. It was the first weed law that was created in our state, and it has really progressed from there with a lot of changes in the 1920s. The 1950s, and the current law that we work under is the 1973 law with a few amendments over time. The one thing that's very unique to our law, and I would probably outright say that we probably have the best weed and pest program in the country. We are very well organized compared to a lot of states around us, especially compared to states in the east. But one thing that's very unique with the law that we have is it requires each county to have a weed pest control district. That's very unique compared to all the other states around us where they make it optional. Our state requires it. So we know that there is opportunity to manage invasive species in any area of our state. With that, the weed and pest districts are our special districts. They are managed by 5 or 7 board member committee that are appointed by county commissioners.
They are funded through mill levies that are collected locally. They all have district supervisors that they hire, and a lot of them also hire seasonal staff to help them with their spray programs. So as you'll see on my report there, we have about 250 seasonal employees, usually college kids that we hire in the summertime, give them an opportunity to do something outdoors and work in Wyoming. We also have, the districts are organized in what we call the Wyoming Weed and Pest Council. Council was created in 1939. It was a biannual conference at that time. We are preparing for our 75th anniversary conference coming up in Evanston this coming fall. It's been a very good council in terms of it's been very proactive in a lot of things, from the weed-free forage program that they created with Montana and Utah back in the 80s to biocontrol research. And a lot of the funding that the state does for biocontrol research is instigated through the Weed and Pest Council. There's a lot of states that collectively work on that with us, but we kind of lead the charge in terms of funding in a lot of ways.
Thank you, Mr. What's the date on that?
The date on that meeting is, Mr. Chairman, the date on that meeting, Representative Blake, is going to be November 5th, 6th, and 7th. And it will be at the Roundhouse in Evanston. I believe you've signed that Roundhouse at some point in your career.
Thank you. Yes.
Mr. Chairman, Weed and Pest Council also works collectively with, like I say, the 23 weed and pest districts, but we also work with the University of Wyoming. College of Ag is a very important component to the council. And of course, the Department of Ag with guidance through helping with grants, with program policy and what have you. So it is, council is made up of those three entities, and it's, like I say, a very effective program nationally. We have, the weed pest districts are driven by what is called the designated list in the state of Wyoming, and the designated list is species that majority of the districts through a resolution with the council and with the Board of Agriculture have determined are priorities for all 23 districts to treat. So right now that list consists of 30 species, weed species, and 5 pests. And I'll make a clarification. I put on my sheet that all the pests on our list are native. That's prairie dog, mountain pine beetle, ground squirrels. I'm missing something on there, but beet leafhopper though is not native. It is actually an invasive pest that we have on that list. So, but we do have 5 pests on there and 30 weeds that we manage. In most cases, all 30 of those species are invasive species. There is one species on there that's skeleton leaf bursage that is a native species that is a concern, especially with wheat growers. And so that's been on our state list, and that's been on the list since the 1950s. So one thing that is kind of, when you compare what our state does, you look at other states, and I included in your packet lists of invasive species from a couple states on the Pacific coast specifically. You'll see they have lists that are in 120 and 130 species. Very long lists. Our lists are rather short compared to that, but a lot of the species that they are listing in their states are of high concern to possibly show up in our state. We've seen a lot of our species, including Medusa head and Bentonata, that have started out, whether it's in Washington or Idaho, and progressed east from those areas. And we also are aware of several species, including desert knapweed, brush skeleton weed, that are out close to us now that could potentially be showing up in our state in the near future. So their lists are a good place for us to look at and see exactly where we need to be paying attention or what species we should be looking for. And just a good example that I mentioned in my packet is yellow star thistle is a species we have started seeing some different infestations in the state. It's a species that has 1.5 million acres of impacted lands in California. A very aggressive knapweed plant in the knapweed family. And that's one that, very similar to what we're trying to do with Medusa head Bentonata, is get out in front of it and eradicate it where we can. In terms of the movement of and transportation of invasive species, there's 2 places that we really try to focus on. Obviously, there's a lot more than that. We have railroad issues. Railroads have been identified since the 1800s as a movement vector for invasive species. You can tie it back to Russian thistle. When it was first introduced, it took only 5 years to move across the western states simply by following the railroad tracks. And a good example we have that right now is a species called Viper's bug loss. It's down next to the Union Pacific Railroad, and it goes through 3 counties. And it's another species we're trying to get ahead of and treat as an early detection rapid response, and treat them wherever we find them. So the problem with railroads is we do have laws on the book that require railroads to spray for invasive species, and they do send crews annually through the districts to treat those areas. However, sometimes, when you guys are probably aware, right-of-ways on the railroad can be pretty extensive in some places. I've got places I can think of in Laramie County where it's probably 60, 70 yards in right-of-way. And a lot of times when they do those treatments, they're not getting past the first 10 feet from the tracks. So it's a very difficult situation in terms of keeping them on track with the whole area along those railroads. Obviously, highways and interstates are a very important area for us to manage. The Department of Ag has a contract with YDOT where we oversee a highway and interstate treatment program, and we allocate funds directly to the districts to implement that program. If anybody is by chance driving down to Denver the next week, you'll see what the difference is between 2 programs. With Colorado, you'll see the impacts of hoary crest right now along those interstates with the program where they don't treat, compared to how we treat our interstates and highways in the state of Wyoming with those funds.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The railroads. I know we discussed this a little earlier, you and I, privately, but is there a fine connected with Wyoming Statute 379311? Can the state fine the railroad for not doing a good job, or that'd be my first question, Mr. Chairman. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Blake, not with that specific statute. There are some fines that are associated with the weed and pest law. They are very difficult to enforce. I mean, you're talking about, you have to get permission to go on and do the inspection. You have to do a resolution, and you have to have a court basically assist with assigning those fines. So it's a very difficult process in terms of actually collecting fines for non-compliance.
A follow-up, Mr. Chairman. I know they spray in like the Green River Yard. They just drive around the yard and maybe take interior rails. The vehicles they use ride on the rails. Do they actually ride on the rails on the main line and spray, or do they spray from roads and spray the right-of-way, or a combination of both? I really don't know.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Blake, it depends. On one of the contractors for one of the railroads, they ride on the rails and they treat right off of the rails. The other railroad has implemented and used helicopters in the past, but I'm not quite sure they're doing that still. We haven't really found out what their plan is in the coming couple of years. So they've used different mechanisms to do those treatments.
And just to follow based off of that, in terms of when you, I guess maybe notice an introduction of the invasive species in the area, are the roads still an issue compared to, say, highway traffic or any other types of traffic? How would you rate the introduction of invasive species by railroads as compared to the overall issue?
Mr. Chairman, it's a great question. I would say equally the 3 priorities for introduction are going to be railroads, pipelines, and interstate highways. And I don't know if I would say one above the other. They all have their own issues associated with them. For instance, you take 4 million cars traveling through Yellowstone, and 18% of those vehicles, if I understand correctly, come from California. The opportunity for that introduction is pretty high. So, that area, the highway is going to be more of a concern than the railroads, but when you get down to the southern counties, the railroads might have a bigger impact. But pipelines, definitely, if you don't do good reclamation on a pipeline, it can have severe consequences when it comes to invasive species. Thank you.
Senator Stearns.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a question. So if the railroad and the pipelines cause a lot of this, do they pay anything in, or is just their spraying their contribution?
Mr. Chairman, and I hope I understand this question right when you say they pay in terms of pay to do the treatments. A lot of the pipeline companies do have in their contracts a requirement to do the treatments. Sometimes the difficulty is there's ownership changes on those pipelines or the right-of-ways. in finding the right people to contact. I will say that there's a lot of those pipeline companies that do a great job of doing the treatments and working with weed pest districts to ensure that there are treatments. There are some places where we're just not quite connecting.
Representative Clausen? Mr. Chairman, do we have a mechanism to like bar freight if we, or the freight or certain materials from places that have these long lists of these really bad weeds? Is there a mechanism we can do that?
So, Mr. Chairman, as you see, I included an example of a quarantine that we have in the state of Wyoming. And that quarantine law may be an opportunity where if we needed to bar the importing of goods, we could utilize that. Difficulty with quarantines are enforcement. There are good quarantines out there for farm products in Park County, Bighorn County, and Teton County. But even then, so it's kind of difficult to have good enforcement on that. We have contracts with Highway Patrol, especially in Teton County, to help monitor their quarantine for hay products. But it's not a high priority for those guys to be shutting down every truck that comes in with hay. So it kind of comes down to priority. But there is the opportunity with quarantines if we needed to go that route.
Okay, along those lines, just to follow up, it seems like a lot of the western states, Oregon, Washington, California, have the most significant problems. Just it seems like fairly intuitive that it's because they have ports. Is that the reason why that these invasive species come from overseas? I just want to make sure I understand.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, it's a good question. And obviously, our invasive species tend to come from Europe, Asia, and it is those port states where you usually see that introduction occur. You have some places, a good example is garlic and mustard, where it has shown up on the eastern side of the state, probably coming from North Dakota or South Dakota, where it's been for a while. But really in Wyoming, we kind of tend to look to the west to see what's going to hit us next.
Thank you. Any further questions? Okay, go ahead and continue.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I'll kind of jump ahead. We did talk a little bit about quarantine. We do have 3 quarantines, as I mentioned, in our state. They are for the movement of farm and hay products. A lot of the enforcement questions with specifically Park County weed pest may defer to Josh Shore, who's the supervisor from that county, who is testifying a little later. So he can kind of explain how they actually go about doing releases and how they go about the enforcement of that program. But that Quarantine Act was actually started in 1968, renewed in 1980. So it's been around for quite a while and is probably the oldest, well, it is definitely the oldest quarantine in our state, but that Park County was probably the leader in terms of moving the invasive weed issue forward with the state. There's a lot of history there in terms of the farmers really working to try and clean their crops up and what have you. So I would say that's probably where you see the weed control efforts really started from. That's why they have that quarantine there. Just to break down a little bit what we do for treatments. As I mentioned, we do have different funding sources. One being that there is a mill levy that is available to the districts that they can utilize, and that's probably their primary funding. We have funding that is available, as you guys are aware, for state lands, and the districts help the state lands with treatments on state lands for invasive species. There's also various federal lands funding that is out there. We use cooperative agreements with the Forest Service and BLM to help them with treatments on the federal lands. We also have U.S. Forest Service state and private forestry grants that assist with private landowners that are neighboring federal lands. So there's a lot of opportunities in terms of grants that can assist with the issue. Problem with grants have a tendency to be a one-year funding source. When it comes to invasive species, it takes a long-term commitment, especially with annual grasses, invasive annual grasses. You just can't treat that once and assume that you'll walk away and the problem is taken care of. So there has to be a lot of follow-up.
Senator Chávez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just while we're on this part, I was wondering who is responsible for weed control around our reservoirs? Because when we're talking about our railroads and our roadways and how seeds move, and there's a lot of thistle around a lot of our reservoirs, and we see that coming down to the irrigation channels and then into our fields. And so who is responsible for that? Is that a framework? And then how are we dealing with that?
Mr. Chairman, Senator, that's a great question. If it's Bureau of Reclamation land or managed lands, they are responsible for it. They have a budget for noxious weed management on Bureau of Rec property or managed property. And they typically work with cooperative agreements for our districts to do those treatments. The last several years, the Bureau of Rec has had difficulty in doing cooperative agreements with the districts and have been trying to work their weed management through a bid process. And it has basically no work has been done because they haven't been able to find federal businesses registered with federal agencies who are willing to do that bid, or the bid's coming way too high that they just can't do the work. So it's a place that we've been trying to work with in the last couple of years to get the Bureau of Rec to be more proactive and utilize the districts, because the districts know where those weeds are, and at least involve them in the planning process a little better than they have. Right?
Is there anything we can do to help you with that?
Mr. Chairman, Senator, possibly. We are going to try to sit down with them this summer and have a discussion on this and see where they go. I guess I would maybe ask to hold off until we have that conversation and see exactly what their responses are.
Any further questions? Okay, please continue.
At the request of the committee, I did include some of the funding sources that we have with the Department of Ag that deal with invasive species. You can see that we have the $500,000 that comes through the YDOT program that we administer, that we allocate out to the districts for that right-of-way highway program that I mentioned before. We also have a funding that's called our Special Management Program, which is funds that we allocate to districts who are utilizing their second mill for emphasis on leafy spurge. And basically they have to be collecting their full second mill before they can utilize those funds from the department. And then we also have what we call the pesticide registration fee grants. And those registration fees, you probably remember, you guys discussed in 2016 an increase to assist with the pesticide education program. The funding that, some of the funding that is collected off of that registration, we're collect $90 per pesticide that's registered in the state at this point. Before 2016, it was $75. And some of those funds are utilized by the districts to pay for large-scale programs or programs that maybe, they need a matching dollars for federal grants. Those grant funds are allocated through a committee that's called the State Allocation Committee, made up of the Director of the Department of Ag, Board of Ag member, and 3 members of the Weed Pass. So we utilize the committee to make sure we get those funds on the ground. Those funds are typically not utilized for administrative costs. They're utilized specifically for acres treated. So it's been a really good program for us, especially for those districts that may not have the budgets to fully deal with the issues that they have. So with that, I will probably just kind of drop it off and open it up to additional questions whenever you're ready, and probably talk about it, WDA's program from there.
Okay, great. And just really quick on the pesticide registration piece, it looks like in our handout it says Weed and Pest PRFG is at the grant program, is that correct? Correct. Okay, all right, just making sure. And so who pays those registration fees? Is it the rancher who applies pesticide on his land? Is it a commercial applicant? The person, that company that is in the state that's selling the pesticide, who pays that?
Now, Mr. Chairman, the companies who actually want to sell the product in the state of Wyoming pay that registration fee. So, for instance, we have a lot of products that Weed and Pest utilize from Corteva and Bayer, and those companies are responsible for paying those fees before those products can be sold in the state.
And so that's obviously they sell in many states, maybe all of them. Do you have a general idea of how those fees compare? Our $90 fee compares to surrounding states?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, you can see I included in your packet a map that kind of, I did some research just to kind of compare where all the states were on the registration fees. And as you can see on that map, even with that $15 increase you guys did in 2016, we are still the lowest state in terms of what we charge for the registration fees. The next closest, we're at $90 per product. The next closest would be New Mexico at $100. But you can see that between the two of us, or the states surrounding us especially, you have Montana at $233 per product. So there's a certain variation in what the states collect. We're certainly the lowest.
Okay, so any questions, committee, on the just general overview of weed and pest?
I know you said you weren't going to talk about prairie dogs, but on my way up here, I noticed a number of prairie dog mounds along the interstate. How does the weed and pest assist landowners with prairie dogs?
Mr. Chairman, Senator, we do various things. We do cost share programs where we will actually sell rodenticides to the landowner at a reduced cost. Some do 80-20, so the landowner picks up 20% of the cost, the district picks up the 80% of the cost. There are certain circumstances in districts where they'll actually go out and do the treatments for the landowners, depending on the size of the towns or how bad the problem is. So it does vary a little bit from district to district, but we do, at the minimum, there's a cost share program in each county that will assist with prairie dogs.
So the product, what product do you use there to control?
Mr. Chairman, there is 3 products that you typically see used for prairie dogs. One, and it's probably on the market the longest, is zinc phosphide. And that is a rodenticide that actually creates a toxic gas in their digestive system when they eat the poison bait. The other product is phostoxin, which is a highly toxic fumigant. And it's a tablet that you put down the hole, and it basically suffocates the prairie dog within its actual hole. And the third is probably the newest product, and that's called, it's an anticoagulant. It's called chlorfascinone and difascinone, Rosol, or put into product names. And they are where they actually is absorbed into the muscle, and it basically the prairie dog internally bleeds and kills them that way. Really, those are the 3 products out there that are usable. Sometimes the biggest issue with rodenticides is the labels and what the labels allow for in terms of treatments, time of year for treatments, retreatments, and the time it takes also to go out and do search for carcasses after you do the treatment. So there's limitations beyond the products that come with those labels too.
Just one more follow-up, Mr. Chair. So here's my concern is let's say one active landowner treats him and his neighbor doesn't. I guess we all know that it's not long until you have the problem again. Is there any, how do you control that, or how would we control that?
Mr. Chairman, those issues do come up with prairie dogs as they do with weeds. Typically, how we handle that, going back to the earlier questions, we do have enforcement language within our law. And that enforcement language starts with the resolution that's passed by the board. And if the resolution is passed, a letter is sent to the landowner where the problem is. And basically saying what the problem is and what they can do to treat the problem. Beyond that, you can get into the fines. It's a very difficult process to do. Typically, we don't have to do that because the cost share program that's available for the counties, it's very hard for a landowner to say, well, I'm not going to do anything because I can't afford it when we have a cost share program that will help them the cost to do that. So I haven't seen any of those issues with prairie dogs that have progressed beyond that resolution and letter. But there are some places where, it's a constant battle because one landowner does something and the neighboring landowner does not.
Representative Simpson.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a couple observations, if I may. I was recently traveling in some neighboring states, and along the side of the highway, I identified some of the plants that you've shared with us in your booklet. And I made a comment to my wife, those invasive plants would never exist in our state along the highways. And so I compliment all of the weed and pest agencies for doing a nice job in that regard. The second one is just for the committee's information. One of my neighbors has a contract with the Bridger Teton National Forest to take his horses back in with weed spray and to find and identify and to spray weeds in the Bridger Teton National Forest. They actually give him coordinates. He takes his string back horses and sprays that. I compliment him for that. I don't know if that's widespread amongst all the forests. We're quite often critical of our federal colleagues, but in this case, I compliment them for being proactive and continuing to manage noxious weeds on the forest.
Thank you, Representative. Okay, Representative Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Back to prairie dogs. They had a huge outbreak of plague at the national, or Thunder Basin National Grasslands. Was that statewide, or was that just there because it decimated the prairie dogs there? That'd be my first question.
Mr. Chairman, when that plague happened 2 years ago, you really could watch it progress from the northern counties all the way down through Douglas. So it really started up near Campbell County, and you could just almost talking to the landowners and ranchers out there, you could talk, they would tell you that they saw it here, and then next thing we know, it would move a little farther south, and then it would move a little farther south. So it did take out a lot of the issue towns that we had on the Thunder Basin grasslands, and kind of, from my perspective, hit the reset button a little bit, gave everyone a little breath and time to really look to the future and how we can manage the prairie dog issues out there to keep it from getting like it did probably 4 or 5 years ago.
A follow-up, all the ways they get rid of prairie dogs. Let's say my dog eats a prairie dog that was poisoned. Is it fatal to your dog, or?
So, Mr. Chairman, this is the issue that has come up mostly with the product I mentioned as Roselle put the anticoagulants is there is concern about secondary poisoning. However, in most cases, if there is a secondary, if there is scavenging, I guess, on the prairie dogs, those animals most likely will not eat enough of that, those prairie dogs to get a lethal dose. So it's going to be in the system. It's going to be in the tissue of the prairie dog. But the other thing to note is in most cases, when the prairie dog is poisoned or prairie dogs are sick in general, they're going to go in their hole. They're not going to be out on top of the ground.
Any further questions?
Thank you, Jim. Well, if you go out and survey after you poison the area, what do you do? Run a camera down a hole to determine what the death rate is?
Yeah. So, Mr. Chairman, are you talking with the labels in terms of doing the post-treatment surveys? So, and I don't have the label in front of me, so I'm trying to paraphrase here, but you actually have to run, I think it's at 5 miles per hour, doing lines back and forth in the areas you treat. And if you do find a prairie dog that is poisoned and dead, you have to take that prairie dog, put it down a hole and bury it. But it is, I think it's a minimum of 2 or 3 surveys post-treatment that the applicant is required to do. So it's a laborious process.
Representative Blake.
Thank you. YDOT designated and declared right-of-way control. Does that money come from YDOT and then you spray all the state highway systems, and then also on county roads, do you guys work with the counties on spraying county roads?
Mr. Chairman, that is correct. The money does come from YDOT. It comes to WDA, and then we use the state allocations committee to allocate those funds to the 23 districts based on their needs. Those 23 districts then do the treatments, or they contract out the treatments based on what their needs are there. And then at the end of the year, they report back to me a spreadsheet with all the center lane miles that they've treated in their county. And then we put a final report together for YDOT at the end of the year. We do have a lot of the districts that also do work with the county roads for the county, but there are some of those counties that have their own spray crew or contract separately from the districts.
Any further questions on the journal overview? I have one, if nobody else does. We're going back to the quarantine, just going through the statutes here. Looks like the quarantine can only apply to farm products. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, I should have brought my quarantine law right in front of me, but the majority of that quarantine law is based on farm products. But I think there's a couple places under that law that I would have to look and get back to you. But be brought into nursery stock, if you want to call it that, or some equipment, for that matter too. So, but it is really more focused on farm equipment, just off the top of my head.
Right, and the fact is the only 3 core teams active in the state are all revolving around ag products, right? So it's not necessarily looking at somebody bringing, say, a tourist or a railroad bringing in something from the West Coast. It's more of the concentrate ag use.
Mr. Chairman, it might be a really tweaking the interpretation of those quarantines to work with or make them work on the railroads. Might be difficult.
Right. Any further questions? Okay, well, I think that kind of covers the overview for now, and also we can always circle back as we go throughout the day. But that being said, I suppose we'll probably just go ahead and move on to the plant industry at a specific overview or inspections. And after that, we'll go ahead and public comment unless somebody has something that they have with the general overview. Okay, let's go ahead and press forward then.
Mr. Chairman, I'm Blythe Cross. I'm with the Department of Agriculture Technical Services Division, and I'm going to give you the responsibilities of the Technical Services Division to mitigate the invasive species in the state statutorily. We have 4 part-time inspectors, basically. They have either 5 to 8 counties that inspector covers. Each one of those inspectors has weights and measures duties or administrative duties. Our first responsibility is to nursery stock law. We perform about 100 nursery stock inspections a year. That's a minimum. When we go into a nursery, we look for diseases that might impact the alpha-native plants in the state. We look for noxious and prohibited weeds, either being in the potted plants around the trees and such, or actually being sold as to be planted. We look for barberry. Those are prohibited plants. Certain types cause stem rust in wheat, and they cannot be sold in the state. Oxide daisy gets sold as a flower every once in a while, and basically take all those off sale. We look for any invasive species such as your African large snails. Those have been found in the state. I found some in a box store in Cheyenne not too long ago. We make sure that they have import permits and health certificates with all the plants that are being shipped into the state. Our responsibility with the seed law, we do about 120 inspections a year. That's a sampling. We sample those seeds, we package them up, send them to the University of Wyoming Seed Lab. At their lab, they run analysis on them, make sure that they are what they are sold as. And they also look for any prohibited or noxious weeds. If we find any violations in those, we get with the company and the store that's actually selling them, take all the product off the sale, and move on from there. We also do label reviews under the seed law. We do approximately 400 of them a year. There we look for prohibited noxious weeds being sold. A lot of it's in flower seeds. Again, you get your oxide daisies in there quite a bit. If we ever find those, all those products are immediately taken off sale and shipped back to the company. Under the apiary law, we inspect 100% of all the apiaries or honeybees that are coming into the state. We do 1/3 of the hobbyists. Hobbyists are those individuals that have 5 or less hives in their possession. We look for small hive beetles, fire ants, varroa mites, wax moths, just different pests that actually attack the honeybee. If we find those, we work very close with our beekeepers to make sure that we can get rid of those problems. The biggest one being the varroa mite is probably what causes the biggest deprivation in all of your honeybees. We have about 426 honeybee keepers in the state, and we have 53,000 hives, approximately. Our cooperative agreements, we work with USDA APHIS. We set up gypsy moth traps across the state, and we do capra beetles. Our grain warehouse inspector does a capra beetle at the actual grain warehouses across the state. We've also done sod inspections for sudden oak death. That was within our nursery stock inspections. When we go out and find host plants that are showing some kind of signs of sod and take samples of them and send them to the USDA lab to get them analyzed to make sure that they are not spreading that disease here. We also do specialized pesticide registrations where we do we submit pesticides to the EPA to make sure the product can be used in the state of Wyoming, off-label as to where it is now. Our one for the invasive grasses right now is Section 18. We work very close with the University of Wyoming. Actually, they wrote it for us, and we submitted it to EPA and got it through for your Medusa head and Nevada. And I believe we're going to look at getting cheatgrass on it this year. And I do have to give a thanks to the Highway Patrol and the ports of entry. They actually check for any kind of import permits, health certificates on both honeybees and nursery stock coming into the state. I am finding a big problem with our box stores. They're loading semis with the plants clerk in front. Not saying that there's anything in there, they're just looking in the back of the truck and they're not coming with any kind of. So basically, that's an overview of what technical services kind of distributes.
Go ahead. Quick question. How do we get, back to your nurseries, how do we acquire giant African snails?
They're usually shipped in potted plants or trees. The ones that I found were in aspen trees from California.
Really?
Mm-hmm. Pretty cool, really.
Pretty cool. My second question is, on your apiary regulations, is it a visual inspection that you inspect for the beetles or the mites? How's that?
It's a visual inspection. We actually open up the hives and go through it with the beekeepers.
What do you do?
We open up the hives and go through it, and the beekeeper's right there with us the whole time so that we can basically talk over any kind of treatments that we're going to do. Varroa mites are one of those that you never get up.
Okay, Representative Larson, then Representative Blake.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I don't know if you talked about the cutter bees and that sort of thing with the alfalfa seed, but that's very important in my area. And chalk brewed, whatever you do there, scanning them, yes.
Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead.
Actually, that's done in Powell. It's the leaf cutter bee lab up there. I don't work in the leaf cutter bees. We just have one individual that usually does it, and she actually retired this year.
Hey, Representative Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I might be going way off base here, but slap me down if I am. Are you going to be involved when they start inspecting hemp products coming into the state? If the port of entry allows them to get past the port of entry.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman? That's a good question. I would be one for our director.
And committee, I guess, well, Director Milo, you want to come answer that question? We are doing pretty good on time, so if it's okay with the committee, if we have a hemp-related question, maybe a follow-up, we'll find out. But
Mr. Chairman, Representative Blake, yes, hemp will be inspected in the same way that all of our ag commodity plant materials are inspected. And the way that I'm looking at hemp right now, obviously we don't know the final because USDA has not accepted our plan for management at this point in time. But the way we propose to do this is to handle industrial hemp seed plant materials the same way that we would other agricultural commodities. Really no difference there, other than we have to be able to affirm that our THC concentrations are below 0.3. That said, there is no way to test seed and be able to predict what the THC concentration in the mature plant will be. So that's something to be worked around, but we'll just be looking at that seed from a germination and purity standpoint, like we do other seeds for other crops.
And I have a lot of other questions, but I would get directed with the director and give him my best instead of taking up time with the committee.
Well, just a follow up on that, correction me about not to get too far down the rabbit hole, but you got the appropriation to implement the state regulations regarding hemp, with the idea being that we, maybe the federal government was going to move a little faster than they did. What's the status of those? I think it's an additional position.
Mr. Chairman, as I understand it, USDA will begin reviewing state plans for management after they promulgate rules. I haven't seen any iterations. They certainly haven't released any for public comment as of yet. They anticipated that rules would be forthcoming and guidance on submission of state plans in the fall. Obviously, as you all remember, the department was under an obligation to get a plan submitted to the USDA within 30 days of the passage of that bill, and we did do that. But that didn't prod USDA. There are several states that have submitted plans already, but none of those states have any guidance or have any feedback from USDA at this point. When I have met with USDA and asked them about their timeline, they wouldn't commit one to me. They said, if you submit a plan prior to us asking you to submit that plan, it's just going to sit here until we get our rules promulgated, and then we'll undertake it at that point. So I don't know what the schedule is going to be ultimately.
Fair enough. Okay, Queen, Representative.
Okay, keep quiet. As far as I know, you can possess hemp products as long as it's under 0.3% THC right now. Is that how you understand it? Pardon?
Mr. Chairman, yes, that's my understanding.
I have to ask this for my auto parts guy. He has chickens. The best bedding that he can find for chickens is hemp, and it's sold in North Carolina. They sell in 44-pound bales. They will not ship to Wyoming for whatever reason. So I just didn't know if you knew anything why they can't ship that to Wyoming, because it's already tested and approved, or if you know anything at all, I'd appreciate it.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Blake, I know a limited amount about some of the conversations that have happened. So you're correct in that if that plant material is hemp and it's less than 0.3% THC, there is no restriction to its interstate transport and sale. That being said, there isn't a good process in place for affirming that plant material is less than 0.3% THC. And there isn't a standard bill of lading process for every state to follow that says this is almost like your health certificate that accompanies cattle when you ship them. That's what I envision happening with industrial hemp. We'll accompany that shipment with a bill of lading that affirms this is our laboratory test and this is what we have found the THC concentration to be. I think that'll take care of most of the issues. Problem that we've run into with ports of entry and law enforcement so far have been that when you conduct a roadside litmus test of some of these plant materials, it's a presence absence test, and they test for THC. That litmus paper turns color, and they say you have marijuana, you have THC presence. The difference now is that you have this distinguishing 0.3% that tell you whether or not that's industrial hemp. It's below that concentration, it's above that, it's marijuana. So the problem with shipping is, what is the exact concentration, and do you have a firm test that you could submit along with that shipment to where you would take care of all of those law enforcement concerns once they do their roadside test? We're working with DCI right now to see if we can get some standards, and they're investigating some alternatives for roadside tests that would help them get more specific. We're in the process of procuring and installing our lab equipment right now. So we'll get better at this as time goes on.
Just one follow-up person.
One more, just the lab, thank you, Mr. Chairman, Director. So the lab equipment has been purchased, or?
Mr. Chairman, there are pieces of that have been, this is kind of complex. It's going to require some additional plumbing and some ventilation work at the lab itself. And we've started the process, And I know we've been through the bid process with the equipment, but I don't know if it's in our possession physically today.
Thank you so much.
Senator Bouchard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, the more that I hear this part discussed, I just wonder, what are the other states doing? Are they more lenient, or, I mean, why are we having to reinvent the wheel on this?
Take a seat, Director.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Senator Bouchard. There are different status for different states, and the reason that you see varying levels of enforcement across the U.S. is the status that most of the states went into the 2018 Farm Bill negotiations. If you had a pilot project that was ongoing as authorized by the 2014 Farm Bill, you were allowed to continue that activity after the passage of the 2018 Farm Bill. Now, as all of you are well aware, there were states that took considerable artistic liberties with the 2014 Farm Bill, and there were some that did that even prior to the 2014 Farm Bill, and were authorizing the growth of these materials without any federal authorization. The 2018 Farm Bill did a lot of good for him in that it removed it from the Schedule I list of banned narcotics. But if you were a state that did not have a pilot project authorized under the 2014 Farm Bill, you're not allowed to do anything with hemp until USDA reviews your state plan for management and approves it. Right now, today, the federal government maintains jurisdiction of hemp, and they can delegate authority for hemp either under the old program that some states were already participating in, or once they review your new plan under the 2018 Farm Bill. That's why you see different states with different levels of authority and different activities in the hemp realm. We're all operating under different sets of rules.
Okay, can we go ahead, Senator Bouchard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I'm just trying to figure out why we not looking at states that were the same position we are and maybe have gone further ahead than we are, that are trying to just be at the back end inventing the wheel. I can't help but to think that somebody else has paved this ahead of us. I mean, because right now Canada's eating our lunch on this deal. I just can't figure out how we can't get to a better place.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Bouchard, we are in an identical position and have had conversations with other states that are in our same scenario. There are many states that were not operating under a pilot project under the 2014 Farm Bill, and they're waiting just like we are. We have compared our plans to all of the states that have pilot projects and those that proposed that weren't operating under pilot projects. So yeah, we have collaborated with many other states in the development of our plan, but there are many states that are just like us that are waiting for USDA to review our plan so that we can move ahead. Those states that are moving right now were operating under the authorities of the 2014 Farm Bill, and that wasn't us.
So we, Director, you're due to report on this, I believe, probably at our fall meeting, the progress of implementing this piece of legislation. Obviously, I think we'll know a little bit more by September. Obviously, it's a lot of hype surrounding this issue, but so far haven't done anything. So I appreciate the update, but it would be safe to say you'll know more by September.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to tell you that I'll know more by September, but if the dialogue goes the way that it has in recent months, I might be every bit as much, may have the same level of ignorance then that I do today, and I will apologize ahead of time for that. We're trying to get as much information as we possibly can, and I know that USDA has been under tremendous pressure from all the states to review state plans, and they have turned that faucet off and just said we'll let you know when we're ready.
Okay, thank you. All right, so we'll go ahead and get back. Don't want to make that happen, but we are ahead of schedule here. So thank you, Director, for that. Sometimes I think everybody's very interested. Thanks for the unprepared remarks, and appreciate your knowledge and work on this issue. So, So getting back to plant industry inspections, I'm looking through the penalty here, Ms. Crossford. It looks like there's a $750 fine, or you can revoke license. I was just wondering, you talk about some of the problems we've had with the big box stores. Do you think that statutory authority is adequate to help compliance?
Mr. Chairman, actually, they're very hard to enforce any of our laws. We can send out any of these which are notice of alleged violations. Most of the companies are really good about following those. To my knowledge, I've been with the department for almost 35 years. I have never seen this put a company out of business for shipping it to the state.
Okay, but you could revoke the license if you wanted, but that's never happened in your 35 years.
Mr. Chairman, no, it has not.
So any more questions? Oh gosh, maybe we should have talked more about him. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it is 11 o'clock. We're an hour ahead of schedule. And so just an overview of how this is going to go. If you look on your agenda, we've had our overview, but we also have several, subtopics, for lack of a better word. We just heard from the plant industry inspections, which in the statutes books are Title 7, Chapter 9, basically. We're going to talk about, after lunch, both the state and federal efforts to combat invasive species. Idea there being, especially in this neck of the woods, the Big North National Forest, there's been a lot of talk with the Forest Service being very proactive in treating for invasive species. So we want to see if there's any possibility there to work together. Obviously, as I think ceremonies alluded to with prairie dogs, similar concept. If you're spraying weeds on federal land but not state or private land, then it's probably going to continue to have an invasive species problem. So that's a general idea with that topic. I think it's already alluded to how foreign shipping and maybe affects this as well. Obviously, these invasive weeds especially come from somewhere overseas, almost by definition. And so we're going to be assessing that. And like I said, we've kind of touched on that already. We look at aerial spraying issues also, as well as this annual grasses overview before we go on that tour. Maybe see some videos ahead, it sounds like. So that's, if you start thinking, start your gears, thinking committee, think about what we could do to help on any of those issues. But right now, we're focusing on the plant industry specifically. So, any questions? I'm hesitant to move forward with the agenda, even though it's all invasive species. We want to make sure if somebody's coming after lunch to talk about any of those specific four areas that we don't kind of pass them by and they show up we're already done before they have a chance to testify. So, any questions at all for Representative Blake?
Thank you. I know I'm talking a lot today, but we didn't really talk much about Russian olive eradication, salt cedar. Could you give us an update report on that? Are we still going after those?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Blake, yes, they're both on our state designated list. A lot of the districts are still implementing programs for the control. We definitely have issues with Russian olive still in the Bighorn Basin. It's probably one of the places you can see it's really aggressively taken over from riparian areas. There's really good programs here in these counties that you're at too. Buffalo, Johnson County has been working on some Russian olive salt cedar removal. And that's one of those programs that we typically see done in the wintertime. Ground is frozen, a little easier to get to it, but it's a very laborious program where you go in and you actually cut the tree down and you treat the stump with some form of herbicide to actually kill the root system. If you don't, they come back like a chia pet. So, it's just the reality of it. But they are very aggressive. That was one that was added to our state list in 2006. So it's one of the newer ones. There was for a couple of years, speaking of nursery stock, we did have to work with the nurseries because they were still selling Russian olive as a planting tree. So it took a little time to do that, but yes, we are still working on those two.
Any further questions for Department of Agriculture? Okay, all right, thank you very much, appreciate it. So at this point, we'll take public comment. Like I said, that we can have anything that the public wants to respond to in a general overview or that specific plant industry inspections. We'll go ahead and take public comment on those two issues at this time. I just have something, right?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, well, if somebody wants to testify, we can break for lunch early. This could be an opportunity. I mean, like I said, we don't have to, if there's anything that's missing in terms of invasive species, don't feel like we have to talk specifically about those subtopics on the agenda. If we did have an overview of invasive species. So that's plants, that's pests, that's all that. So if anyone wants to talk about prairie dogs more, we can talk about maybe consider having to be an invasive species. I don't know. We'll give a little bit of leeway here because we do have about at least 40 minutes so we have before we really need to get going on lunch. So, Mr. Chairman.
Certainly that's standing if anybody wants to say anything. But I do know Brian Mueller is going to be presenting, scheduled after lunch, but I guess I would quick ask you, do you, beyond your presentation, just with the extra time that we have, is there anything further that you would like to go into detail on beyond what you had planned? I'm not necessarily suggesting, Mr. Chairman, that we skip ahead on the schedule, but just if Mr. Mueller or anybody else with him, Luke or whoever wanted to go into any further detail on what they were going to discuss anyway, that might be a good time to start in on that. So, not to put you on the spot, but.
Can I process for just a moment?
Yeah, sure.
Before I answer you.
We're kind of tap dance skills here, so. But yeah, I mean, like I said, you can see what we're going to talk about in the afternoon. So, save your handle on those issues for now. But if there's just anything internally you think that the committee could use, useful knowledge, background knowledge from a local perspective, if anybody here has has dealt with the federal government as well, we're here to have a holistic overview of invasive species in the state of Wyoming. So anybody has any experience of either local or federal, that could be useful knowledge certainly for me, for the committee, as we, because I think a lot of us who've been on the committee for a while, or maybe who are in agriculture ourselves, so we have an idea of how it works in our neck of the woods or how it's worked with the state efforts. But any perspective we have from right up holistic could be appropriate at this time. Okay, go ahead.
But Kevin, I did have a question for anybody who might want to answer. In the information that was provided concerning Oregon Department of Agriculture and the non-competing policy, is there, it is mentioned that they have a weed classification system. Does Wyoming have a similar classification system, or is that a standard setup for most of the states?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Hunt, we do not. There's a lot of states that do a category system with their state lists. I think Oregon, it's category A, category B, category C. And then they say eradication for category A. And I think they get down to like education for category C or D, or their lower ones. We talked about doing that in Wyoming back probably in 2008. The discussion we had, at least in Wyoming, was because the majority of the funding for the invasive weed program is local, we really felt that we should create the list for the state, but let those counties determine what their priorities are locally, instead of the state coming in saying, this is your higher priority, this is your lower priority on the state list. So that was a discussion we had with all 23 districts, and I think the consensus was, let's not go into that categorical listing. That being said, we've had some conversations just recently too, where that topic's been brought up again as maybe we should relook at it and see what people think.
Okay, since we got you up here, Okay, actually, it looks like we have some public testimony, so we'll get back to you, Mr. Franklin, but, yeah, perhaps public testimony here, we'll,
Mr.
go ahead.
Chairman, if I could potentially make a few comments in response to the
Oh, go ahead, yeah.
question, but unless folks want to respond directly to Slade's stuff, I can come back in a moment too. I'm not sure how are you guys, at your pleasure?
Mr. Chairman, put Brian on the spot.
Okay. You're up.
So just by way of introduction, Mr. Chairman and folks, I'm Brian Mueller, Associate Professor at in College of Ag at the University of Wyoming, and Director of the Sheridan Research and Extension Center that we have here. Thank you for a little bit of added time. I thought one of the things that I might respond to your question, Representative Hunt, is to put a little bit of a broader context around the discussion that we're having today. And because of time limitations, maybe that wasn't available earlier. And we're going to focus fairly specifically on a subset of invasive species as our tour and some of the discussion that happens this afternoon, if that is okay to sort of do that. Sure. I think we typically internalize, especially invasive plant problems, as an agricultural problem, partially because it's easy to attach value to agricultural commodities and the impact that those invasive weeds in particular have on those agricultural products. And I think that one of the things that we sometimes don't necessarily process immediately is that it's broader than just an agricultural problem. If we think about the natural resources of the state outside of agriculture and what they contribute to the economy of the state and also to the sort of the internal culture and identity and the society as a whole, there are broad reaching impacts that these invasive species can have that are outside of agriculture. So if you think about tourism and what it brings to our economy and the potential negative impacts of losing species diversity and losing wildlife habitat in an ever declining curve that we will touch on a little bit later this afternoon, it broadens that discussion out much more. And so when we tease that out to those secondary impacts and how these species can affect how grazing animals use the system and how fire behaves in some of these natural systems, they can potentially have not only natural resources and agricultural impacts, but they can also have human health impacts and infrastructure impacts. And so when we think about all the different things that we face as a state that is largely very closely tied to our natural resources and the economy and the culture that brings, and we think about our energy infrastructure and all these other items that we sort of uniquely identify with in the state of Wyoming, it's difficult to find a natural resource issue or an agricultural issue that spans across all of these different things that we have to deal with in a way that invasive species do. And so if we think about energy development in the southwest part of the state and how when we disturb our natural systems, it potentially enhances the opportunity for invasive plants to move into those systems that then can move into undisturbed habitat. It is, I guess, partially I commend you guys for taking this emphasis today, which is biased because this is what I do my research on. But at the same time, it's a very cross-cutting threat that can potentially impact the state at a number of different levels. And because of that, and I think someone's going to comment on this a little bit later today as well, is that given the land ownership patterns and management processes in the state, it's such a complex problem in itself biologically, but then across multi-jurisdictional land ownership patterns, it then becomes an interesting challenge in cooperating across those jurisdictions. And I will reiterate what was said earlier that in many ways, I think the state of Wyoming leads in managing invasive species across these multi-jurisdictional boundaries. And part of that was because of the foresight of the legislator back in the day that set us up the way that we are in a cooperative relationship between the university and Wyoming weed pest. That's my on-the-spot comments, and I would be open to any questions, Mr. Chairman, if there is time.
Any questions?
Real quick, Glenn, a lot of our discussions that we've been having are, I think, somewhat concerned, mainly focused on what's coming in from overseas and the codes, but how, do you know how alert or trained or aware are Border Patrol and customs agents on the Canadian border, and what is other situations versus our neighboring border states like Idaho, Montana, and North Dakota?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Hunt, it's a great question. In one way, we're fortunate in that we are usually the last state to get some of these new invasive species. I would be happy if some of our other states would have figured out how to manage and get rid of them before they got to us. I would say that there's a wealth of educational opportunities for folks that are doing these inspections, and APHIS and agencies such as that are pretty in tune. The thing that is difficult from both a regulatory standpoint and a research standpoint is those species that we do not know whether they will be invasive or not, if they have not shown to be so elsewhere. Predicting which of those species are going to be problematic when they get introduced into a new location is kind of difficult in and of itself. And so there's a balance between being overly restrictive as to what can be introduced into the country as far as new products, and then being appropriately prudent in how risk averse we are. Because the last thing that we do want to see introduced into the U.S. is the next leafy spurge or salt cedar or Russian olive. I will say that it's somewhat fortunate in that we can see how these species are going to behave after they've been introduced into areas with similar climate to know whether we should be worried about it. And the surveillance and survey approach that not only Wyoming Weed and Pest, but some of our other management partners such as Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, Wyoming Game and Fish, NRCS conservation districts, they are very aware of the species that are high on the list that we're concerned about. And not only them, but we have many landowner partners that regularly attend trainings to enhance their knowledge about which species that we need to be watching for to where we can maintain active surveillance. The negative side is that we've got a bunch of empty country that's hard to get to. And so unfortunately, sometimes we don't find those new infestations until they've already reached a size where effective management is going to be a longer term endeavor, rather than just if you found the very first yellow star thistle and you pulled that out of the ground, then you potentially made a really broad reaching impact. If that answers your question.
And on that, from the scientific research side of that, speaking more broadly, not just to species being found in a new area, but new species altogether, and so on and so forth, is there any study or estimate out there on the number of species that could potentially impact us as far as what we know exists and what is adaptable to our climate, or is that kind of an unknown territory? Does that make sense? I mean, like as far as foreign invasion, if you're including species out of, I don't know, Europe or Asia or whatever, do we have any idea of what exists in the world that could take root in Wyoming with the climate that we have versus what is already here? And I mean, just hypothetically, of course, but how many species do we not yet have potentially that could have under direct circumstances?
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I think I'm trying to wrap my mind around how to address this. I think the short answer is no. I don't think we have an idea. There's some rough estimates that about 10% of species that are introduced into a new continent effectively establish and form self-sustaining populations. There's a lot of variability around that 10%, a relatively minor amount of what potentially gets introduced established. Relatively minor amount of those, roughly potentially 10%-ish again, that establish. begin to move unaided into new systems, which would classify them technically as an invasive species. And then roughly about 10% of those become highly problematic. So of species that get introduced from, for us, Eurasia to North America, it's really a small proportion of those that end up becoming highly problematic. The problem is when we also combine those introductions with intentional breeding to make them more successful or to make them more desirable in those locations, then we increase the probability of that happening. And so I would put if I had to ballpark your question, it would be potentially hundreds more species through time that could become problematic. I feel like the things that we are dealing with now were introduced back in the late 1800s, early 1900s to the continent. And so I feel like we've changed our practices for introduction and horticultural sort of evaluation a lot since that point in time. But that's not to say that there aren't another suite of species that could come from high elevations in South America or something at some point in time that might also be suited.
Any more questions, Senator Science?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wondered, how are we doing managing the invasive species we already have? Would you categorize us as kind of on top of the situation? Does each area have its own diagnostics? How are we doing with what we already know we have?
Within the state of Wyoming, I think we have the framework in place to be as effective, if not more effective, than many of our neighbors. I would say that we give you an example. There have been several species that were located, found, and identified in the western part of the state over the past 5 to 10 years. The two species that come to mind are brush skeleton weed and yellow star thistle, where these species were small populations that were recognized by someone that knew what they were looking at, and rapid treatment was implemented on those populations, and continued follow-up monitoring in those locations. And we feel like those species do not currently have self-sustaining populations in the state. To me, for new species moving in, that shows pretty clearly that we have an effective surveillance and rapid response team that is collaborative across a number of different jurisdictions. And I think we'll hear about that more today. The well-established long-term species that we've had in the state for a long time, leafy spurge, Russian knapweed, some of the thistles, and I would argue cheatgrass. I feel like there's been a shift in the past 20 years in thinking more from a wholesale systems ecological framework rather than just what is this and how do I kill it? And so our weed and pest folks and additional partners, in my opinion, are taking it from much more, I don't know, sophisticated is the right word, but a much broader perspective rather than just killing weeds into managing agricultural lands and wildlife habitat. And so can we say that we have effectively eliminated a well-established species in the state? I don't think we have. But I also don't think that's a biologically realistic goal. And so if we look at minimizing the impact of the widespread species that we already have established, I think we are. And I think we can point to some really good success stories around that. And I think that trajectory is just going to continue to improve in the state. And we'll talk a little bit more about that contrast this afternoon as we go on the field tour. I think we're moving the needle in the right direction. Can we hang our hat and say we've won the war? I don't think so, and I honestly don't think that we will ever be able to pat ourselves on the back and say that we have been done. I think continued diligence and long-term commitment to managing these populations is actually required to maintain the quality of wildlife habitat and agricultural lands that we have. That answers your question.
And just to follow based off that, we had some discussion earlier about the pesticide registration fee and how it's the lowest in the country, and a lot of it goes to these grants. So if we were to increase in our on our materials, it said an increase in $90 per product, $130 per product, and registration fee would raise almost $1 million in additional revenue for grants in particular. If that was what ended up happening, do you think that would be beneficial to that ongoing effort then?
Mr. Chairman, I do. I think that the details of how those dollars are allotted to be spent and toward what things probably dictate how successful those programs become. If they're appropriated in a strategic way, then I think that would. One of the primary limitations is long-term sustainable funding to manage these programs. And so even though our weed and pest folks are well-funded and typically very successful at obtaining grant dollars, I think a stable source of additional funding would definitely move toward a more positive outcomes.
On that note, and I meant to crunch the numbers on this myself, but over here on the Roman 6, and 1006, the biennial budget has been decreased from 1.25 million to 773,000. And then over here, of course, with $130 registration fee, you're saying that would bump it to 1.6 million. But does anybody have an estimate of what, if you didn't go all the way to 130, what you would have to raise it to at least get it to the 1.25 million that it once was?
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to have to defer to someone else on that one. On the state budget stuff, I can talk about science and weeds, but when it comes to that anything, I'm going to defer.
Mr. Chairman, I put that number together there, and I did not specifically come up with what that cost would be to make up that difference, so I can come back with you that information later.
But Mr. Frank, if we had, say, a draft bill that had as a placeholder $130, if we were going to discuss that at the next meeting, we could come up with a more precise number, and depending on what the objective of the committee would be, to whether replace the funding that was cut or to increase it a little bit based on inflation, whatever the penalty is. I mean, you can come back if we were to say draft bill along those lines for the pesticide registration fee. You can provide that information in the same. Okay. All right, so any further public comment so far? Okay, going once, going twice, public comment is closed. Committee, do we have any motions on these first two topics, whether a general overview of invasive species or specifically the plant industry inspections? Chairman.
Mr. Chairman. Concerning the registration fees and costs, I don't know, because we just did this in 2016. I don't know that I want to make a motion quite yet on the bill draft, but I would like to see what the thoughtful hand of who would be interested in possibly moving forward with the fee increase on this.
Okay, so just your own concept, it would be okay with just drafting the bill so we can have it.
I'll go ahead.
Okay, so to increase the registration fee from $90 product to $130 product. I'll second. I think it's a discussion we need to have. And just, Mr. Frank, if you come back up here, make sure I understand this correctly. This is not something that's going to be assessed on local businesses. It's going to be primarily from a businesses who are out of state and who are commercial vendors of these products. Is that correct? Or if there's anybody who lives in the state that would be negatively affected by increase in this registration fee, I'd like to hear about.
Mr. Chairman, it would be the companies that are registering these products to sell in the state. A lot of them are out of state. I would have to look and see if which ones, if there are any that are in the state who are paying that fee. I can come back to that information, but majority of them are going to be out of state, if not all of them.
Okay, and we talked about the importance of having consistent funding sources, which, I mean, during these cuts we saw and recently, they didn't cut the fees necessarily, they cut the general funds, right? So to the extent which we are reliant on fees and not general funds, that's going to provide stability, which is especially important when it comes to invasive species. Is that correct?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, the very unique thing about these funds for the districts is, and I think Sheridan County would be one that can talk to you about that. They manage 12 grants. And those are federal grants, state grants, and there's always match requirements with that and restrictions in terms of what you can match and not match in terms of dollars. This funding has been very helpful for them in terms of giving them a base start in terms of funding that they can match the various programs that are out there. And it has been used as kind of a consistent source on some of those large scale programs for what Brian talked about with the monitoring and survey and follow-up.
Yes, any questions for Mr. Franklin? Any comment on the motion before Representative Henderson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When you were talking, I would, and you referenced this chart earlier. And if you look at the region in Wyoming and where guards, there's a stark contrast. It begs the question, why? And so when you do your preparation, if you wouldn't mind, if you could provide more information on how that cost fits with the need.
Sure. And Mr. Chairman, I'll be happy to do that.
Okay, so we have a motion before us, and I'm going to go ahead and see if there's any public comment, since we did kind of take a turn towards a very specific topic here, a very specific proposal. So, Mr. Kennedy.
Thank you. Keith Kennedy with Wyoming Ag Business Association. We supported the education fee, and our position in the past on this issue has been that changes in the registration fee shouldn't favor one registrant over another. And the Department of Ag can give you specific numbers, but I believe the committee should also be aware that probably a majority of these registrations are not for what you all would perceive as a pesticide. For example, the hand cleaner over here is registered as a pesticide and pays a fee. So anything that has germicidal properties is registered as a pesticide, as are various other similar things that are used by everyday consumers. So I would just ask you to consider that, and that this does favor specific registrants who happen to be our members, as well as some of the other folks that are members who don't produce products that are used for invasive weed control.
Any questions for Mr. Kennedy? So you're saying the fees come from a wide swath of our economy, not just folks who are actually doing the work of combating invasive species, but it basically hits a very wide array.
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. And some of the other increases that have taken place at or after we had our last increase, one that specifically comes to mind is the state of Montana. Their increase was used to fund their water monitoring program, which the Department of Ag participates with USGS in groundwater and surface water monitoring in Wyoming. And so I think it'd also be reasonable to think about whether some of this ought to be dedicated funding for those type of activities that also serve the broader interests of the pesticide industry too.
That makes a lot of sense, and certainly something we consider. If we do move forward with the draft bill, we could certainly modify the provisions of the grants to cover a wider variety of folks who are affected by it. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. So any further questions, comments? Senator Kinski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members. I think it would be a great idea at least to see the bill draft, because once you have it in that final form, then you can start asking questions like, are the end consumers going to actually bear that cost? Is that a cost that can be shifted? I know that when we went through that increase for the education in the past, I never heard a peep from any of my producers. I don't think it cost them a dime in the end. I think it's all these big out-of-state companies that they don't even notice it. It's rounding error to them. But I'd like to say that if that's not what's going to help fund these programs, because we're kind of losing ground on the weed pests and these invasive species, if we don't get it from there, then we're looking at the general fund and the LISRA. I don't know that we're going to get the kind of money out of that we really need to make this thing happen. So I would urge the committee to at least get a bill, and then just voting to have a bill doesn't necessarily mean that you'd support it, but at least it gives us a chance to study what what economists call the incidence of the increases. It's something that the end consumers in Wyoming will ever really bear. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any questions for Senator Kinski? So I guess I have one from your perspective on appropriations. Is that, I guess, intuition correct, that if it's a fee-based revenue source, it's much more stable than, say, relying on general funds or the LISRA, in that case, maybe?
Absolutely.
Okay, any questions for me? Okay, thank you, Senator.
I was uncharacteristically brief because I'm hungry.
Right. We're getting there. So, since it's open for public comment, any public comment on a specific proposal to get just a draft on to increase these registration fees? Okay, any further comments? Okay, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, say no. Okay, well, that motion passes. Any further discussion on this, on these first two invasive species topics? Okay, going once, going twice, we'll go ahead and break for lunch, come back exactly at 1 o'clock, and we'll get going with the rest of invasive species. Thank you.